This is 20 Minutes of Impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast, sponsored by Uplight. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the podcast series on the demand stack, my guest is Ryan Hledik, principal of multinational business consultant, the Brattle Group, and author of extensive research on the various types of load flexibility. Ryan's going to describe the demand stack concept proposed by energy management and demand flexibility provider Uplight. It's an approach to customer-owned distributed energy resources, or DER, that can maximize DER benefits to utilities, customers, and the power system. Ryan's a Stanford engineer by training, and he began his career in research with Charles River Associates in 2002. After a short time with Stanford's Energy Modeling Forum in 2005, he joined the Brattle Group as an associate in 2006, and after a decade of power sector analysis, he became a principal in 2015. So, Ryan, to begin with, what is a utility or system operator's demand stack, and how does it relate to the traditional idea of a supply stack that utilities and system operators use in planning and operations?
Sure, Herman. Thanks for having me on the podcast again. It's a pleasure to be here. I
It's
do want
always great, Ryan, it's always great to have you, and I really hope you can get the answers to my questions right this
to
time.
I'll do my best. Third time's the charm here. Do want to just start quickly here by giving credit where it's due, as you did. This is, I think, a concept that Uplight has been putting a lot of thought into. Hannah Bascom, Sam Hartnett, and others at Uplight have been doing a lot of work on this. But obviously, I'm happy to share my perspective, and in particular some forthcoming work that we're doing with Uplight on the topic.
Good.
When I think about the demand stack, to me, this is about creating a demand side resource that has this similar scale and operational flexibility as supply side resources, so that a utility system operator can push a button and they can dispatch a power plant, or they can dispatch their demand side resource that has been enabled by the demand stack. So what that means is piecing together the different demand side resources that we have available to us. And kind of the concept that I think Uplight has done a good job of articulating is this idea of energy efficiency sort of being the equivalent of base load generation, load shifting resources like time of use rates serving as intermediate resources, and then demand response serving as peaking capacity. So the goal here is really to get all of those working together. There will be some regulatory and behavioral and technical barriers that will need to be broken down in order for all of this to work. But I think the good news here is there are a lot of established and emerging practices that will enable us to do that. And the goal with the demand stack is really to package all of that to make it work at a time when it's really needed. I think the last thing I'll note here is this is not an entirely new concept. It's been discussed in the past as integrated demand side management, or IDSM. LBNL and ACEEE and others have done some work on this in the past. What's different now is this opportunity is being put forward right at a time when we really have a need for new resources on the system.
Yeah, we've done on the podcast, we've done had conversations about integrated demand side planning and integrated resource planning, and the various flavors of planning that can incorporate the various resources that a utility can have. So let me articulate this. Uplight says that the demand stack can integrate. It describes three types of programs: behavioral, rate-based, and device-driven demand-side utility programs. And it categorizes them: energy efficiency, demand response, time-varying rates. So I talked to somebody who described this demand stack as almost like a checklist. How can you put all that together? There's a lot of things there that might require a little bit of explaining, but you got to get your head around the whole set of things in order to understand how valuable the demand stack is. So, and then, of course, once you understand the value of it, how do you want the utility to use it? So that's a big question, Ryan, but can you pick it apart, and I'll remind you of some of the parts of it that I asked about as you go.
Sure. And maybe to make this a little more tangible, I can give a preview of some of the forthcoming analysis that we have done with Uplight and with Evergy on this topic.
Mm.
Um, in the analysis, we characterized Evergy's system in Missouri in 2030 and then modeled what their demand side management portfolio could look like without the demand stack, and then what it could look like if demand stack strategies were implemented.
Let me just interrupt you there before you go on. Just that's exactly my point. You start with modeling what is possible. That's what utility
Yep.
planning does. And starting there seems to be so crucial to understanding this concept.
Exactly. Yeah, no, this is the first step in a planning process and putting some numbers behind it. So we analyzed four strategies that could all be part of a demand stack approach. The first is improving the participant experience in demand side programs. So an example of that could be micro curtailments, where you're making very frequent but minor adjustments to the customer's thermostat that they won't even notice. So there's zero, essentially zero cost or loss of comfort to the customer. Second is improving performance forecasting. So this isn't about forecasting load. This is about forecasting the performance and the dependability of all the demand side resources that the utility is using. And if you get better at that and you have better predictability of how these demand side resources will perform, that improves your ability to rely on them and reduces the amount of haircut or derate that as a system planner or system operator, you might otherwise have to put in place just to make sure that you won't overcommit. The third strategy was to get smarter about how these programs are dispatched. We kind of wanted to look beyond this idea of just pushing a button and having all of your demand response resources reduce load at the same time. So we analyzed what it would look like if you could actually spread those demand response events out across a broader range of hours of the year and only get the amount of demand reduction that's actually needed on that day to achieve your goals. So smarter dispatch was the third strategy we analyzed. And then the fourth is various options for increasing enrollment in these programs. Point of sale enrollment is a really good example of that has had a lot of impact. So we modeled those four strategies. And then what we found is that the impact of just those four strategies could increase the capability of this demand side portfolio by about 60%. In Evergy's case, that was a 90 megawatt increase. So this really is a utility scale resource that we're talking about here. And what was also interesting to me is each of those four strategies had a relatively similar impact contribution to the 90 megawatts.
Mm.
So I think it really is, a helpful starting point in terms of quantitatively demonstrating what the demand stack could lead to. And the important takeaway that I'll leave you with on this one is like we were just focused on 2030. We were just focused on existing programs and we only focused on four strategies. So there's a lot more that could be done that could make that number even higher.
What's interesting about that is that if you, once you start asking utility to understand the resource, demand side resources, the set of demand side resources in that granular way, it suddenly demystifies them. A lot of utilities, for a lot of years that I've been doing this, and I know you've been doing this, their complaint about demand side programs and demand side resources is that they can't see them, they can't value it. They don't know what they have. But you've completely eliminated that complaint. Am I, or you're moving toward doing that? Is that correct, Ryan?
I think the idea is to move in that direction. Absolutely. I think one of the biggest barriers that we've had to getting to seeing more progress on the demand side in the electricity industry is system operators not trusting them at the same level that they trust a power plant, a supply side resource. And so through better visibility, through more data, through more information about where these resources are located, hopefully over time, we'll get system operators more comfortable with relying on the demand side.
And the second item that you mentioned, I don't remember the exact terms that you use, but the idea is forecasting how much of a resource, a particular resource in the demand stack is going to perform. So that is again that granular quality. How much can you get from a set of smart thermostats before they start losing interest, for instance, in the program? How much can you manipulate, manage, if you will, EV charging? Again, that is a way of quantifying what is going to show up for the utility, and you're showing them that you can quantify it, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it takes you beyond just saying, all right, well, I I know everyone says that those air conditioners are going to give me a kilowatt of demand reduction, but I don't really believe it because I think I could only get that for an hour and then it's going to drop off. So I'm going to derate that to by 80% and assume that each air conditioner will only give me zero point 0.2 kilowatts. This is about getting smarter and saying, all right, it might not be one, but the data is showing conclusively that it's zero point 0.8 kilowatts. And so you don't need to derate this by 80% to in your planning process.
Mm. I think that's a strength of the demand stack idea, is because you identify the demand stack and then you start identifying the granular qualities of it.
The grid is changing fast, with data centers, electrification, and extreme weather driving a surge in energy demand. Utilities can meet the moment with existing resources by activating energy customers and their connected devices with Uplight's integrated demand stack. Uplight coordinates energy efficiency, rates, demand response, and virtual power plant programs into one cohesive strategy to improve grid resiliency and energy affordability. Their AI-powered platform connects customers to best fit programs, then forecasts, dispatches, and measures flexible capacity to deliver megawatts when the grid needs it most. Learn how Uplight is helping leading utilities harness over 8 gigawatts of flexible load at uplight.com/USEA.
I'll move to another question. It is a term that is coming up more and more these days as we think about the load growth that we're facing. The power system is facing electrification, onshoring manufacturing, and of course, data centers. The term is system utilization. It's becoming a key to understanding how to protect affordability, I think, without compromising reliability. So, can you remind I know you've written about this topic, so can you remind our listeners what system utilization is and describe how the idea of demand side resources as a demand stack could improve system utilization?
Sure. Yeah, I think the statistic that you'll hear cited a lot as it relates to utilization is this idea that all of the capacity that we have across our power system is only being used at about 50% of its capability. The reason for that is we have to build out our system to serve the peak, but there are a lot of hours of the year when the electrons flowing across the system aren't anywhere near that peak capacity. So the opportunity that people see is to do a better job of accommodating new load growth with the grid, the existing infrastructure that we already have. We're still going to need to build. We're still going to need to invest in the infrastructure, but the idea is to do that more efficiently and more strategically. So the way that this can have affordability benefits for consumers is, the electricity rates we pay are based on cost. So you can think of your rate as being essentially costs divided by sales, cost divided by megawatt hours. If we can accommodate new load and grow the sales faster than the cost, or in other words, grow the denominator faster than the numerator, you're going to see that rate going down, and actually there being downward pressure on electricity rates. So that is ultimately the goal here. The study that we did that you mentioned that we released last month for the utility system that we analyzed found that a 10% increase in system utilization at a national scale could lead to over $10 billion per year in consumer bill savings. So this is a material opportunity. The question is, well, how do we accommodate new load when we're on what is increasingly a very capacity constrained system? And that is where demand flexibility and the demand stack come in. You can use that to create new headroom on the system to accommodate additional load growth. So in the example that we were just discussing, the 90 megawatts of new capacity that could result from the demand stack and on Evergy's system, that could be available to accommodate new load growth on that system. The key here is the investment that we're making in demand flexibility in the demand stack, that needs to be less than the historical average cost that we've used to serve this new load. And as long as we can bring this new load onto the system at a cost that is lower than the rates they're paying, some of the revenue that they're contributing through their bills is being used to pay for that existing grid, and it takes the burden of the cost of that grid off of other customers' shoulders.
And explain that. How would that work with a data center, for instance?
So yeah, I mean, when a data center is being brought onto a utility system, if this is a utility that is facing capacity constraints, you can think of two scenarios. One is we'll just build out the transmission system, we'll build out generating capacity at a level that's needed to accommodate this new load growth. It's kind of the traditional approach. The challenge with that is it takes a while to do that. So that data center at this point on a lot of utility systems is not going to get added for years. And the other is the cost of generation capacity, the cost of transmission capacity has gotten a lot more expensive than it was historically. So you're going to be paying a premium to do that. And if the rate you're charging that data center isn't fully covering those higher incremental costs, some of that cost burden could be shifted to existing customers. If instead of exclusively building out infrastructure to serve that data center, you're instead able to create capacity for that data center through lower cost alternatives like demand flexibility, then you're able to bring them onto the system at a lower cost. And as a result of that, actually help customers from a rate standpoint rather than hurting them.
And there's a lot of talk about rebellion against building data centers. Of course, the downside of that is that if you don't build a data center where it wants to be built, the region loses a lot of revenues, especially in places where the population isn't too dense. They'd be losing revenues that could go to their fire departments, their police departments, their schools. So there's a value in getting those data centers. And the other interesting thing about it is that a lot of data centers have the potential. It's been discussed as part of this discussion around the demand stack and system utilization. Data centers could buy distributed resources that go on the demand side that could be used to prevent that shift to other residential customers of increased building of infrastructure. Have you heard about that? Have you done any thinking about that, Ryan?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting concept. Term I usually use to refer to that as bring your own distributed capacity. We're
Yeah.
actually doing some work with Google on that right now. They're actively exploring partnerships with utilities that are open to this idea of having Google or another hyperscaler come in and pay to build out their demand side management portfolio and create capacity on the system that way. So I think it's a really powerful idea. And I mean, if you think about a company like Google or Meta or Amazon or Microsoft, the market capitalization of any one of those companies individually is multiples larger than the market cap of all of the investor-owned utilities in the United States combined. So these hyperscalers have a lot of resources to bring to the demand side of the electricity industry, and they are very motivated to create capacity on the system. So I think it is a massive opportunity for the industry.
And all of those resources that they would be financing would go into the demand stack. And then it becomes even more important for the utilities to understand exactly what the opportunities are in the demand stack. Am I saying that right, Ryan?
That's exactly right. And I would actually take it one step further and say, yes, that the money and the resources are going into the demand stack. And ultimately, that means most of that money, the money and the resources are finding their way back to consumers who are participating in these programs. And I think that's a really important and underappreciated aspect of this approach as well.
So, in a lot of ways, if you have the right approach to building a data center, it might be much better for the people that live in that area instead of being much worse. I guess I sounds like it to me. Does it sound like it to you?
It's a possibility. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
there's a lot of work that needs to go into making sure we're getting the rates right, making sure that the demand stack programs that we're investing in are more cost effective than the alternatives. But the opportunity is absolutely there.
And you've done a groundbreaking work on the idea of load flexibility. I think that opened up a lot of conversations that led to where we are now, talking about system utilization and so on. So maybe could you review some of that, what you found in your original work, and explain how is that more pressing now? Um, because we have the potential to build a demand stack and get it into utility programs. And we have this growing load and this load uncertainty. So, I mean, I think that's a thing we haven't talked about as much. The uncertainty, if you're investing in demand side resources, there's a certainty of their value, even if the load doesn't grow as much, right? So I asked you a lot of questions again, but let's pick it apart a little bit. Flexibility, what did you learn about flexibility? And what did you learn about flexibility that demand stack contribute to dealing with load and load growth and load uncertainty?
Sure. So, I think we conducted that study way back in 2019 when we were looking far into the future to 2030 and trying to understand how much load flexibility potential there was across the entire US. We focused on achievable, cost-effective potential. So this was not a technical potential study. And what we found was that there was about 200 gigawatts of potential nationally, relative to around 50 or 60 gigawatts of existing capability today. So a big untapped opportunity. The kind of crazy thing about that 200 gigawatt number is it's understated, in my opinion. It didn't include batteries. It didn't include vehicle to grid. So it didn't include data centers. This was 2019. So there's a lot more potential than maybe even that 200 gigawatt estimate that we put together in 2019. What the demand stack allows us to do is move toward that 200 gigawatt plus potential. And I do think that's possible. It's a big number. I do think it's possible. And there are a few reasons for that. The first is if we look back over the last couple decades and look at national demand response capability, what you see is during the 5-year period between 2006 and 2011, national demand response capability actually doubled from about 30 gigawatts to 60 gigawatts in just a 5-year period. So we've seen that this is a resource that can scale quickly. And given the technologies that have been introduced since 2011, that should be even easier to do than it was 2 decades ago. Second statistic is, we did some analysis and looked at the demand response, demand flexibility capability of US investor-owned utilities. What we found is the top 10% of US utilities, the top decile, can reduce their peak demand by about 12% through their demand response programs. The bottom half of utilities can have the capability to reduce their demand by only about 1%. So I think there are a lot of best practices and approaches that certain utilities have developed that we still have the opportunity to pass on to most of the rest of the industry to significantly increase our capability in this area. And then the third is, if we think about the next 5 years, again, looking out to 2030 or so, analysts are forecasting that with data centers and electrification, we could add about 1,000 terawatt hours a year of load to our system. That's about a 25% increase compared to where we are today. And we're just in a situation, this is in the headlines, that conventional supply is tapped out, right? Like it's a huge wait time for gas turbines. The timeline that it takes to develop the transmission system to get through the interconnection queue, there are huge delays associated with that. So we need new creative approaches to create capacity on the system to accommodate the 1,000 terawatt hours of load growth, and the demand side being enabled by the demand stack is one, I think, pretty important opportunity and the low-hanging fruit that exists to get us there.
And adding demand side resources doesn't take anything like those kinds of timelines that are implied. And it's not nearly as hard to get solar panels and batteries and things like that, although there is competition, but not nearly as hard as it is to get gas turbines, good quality combined cycle gas turbines. You hear a lot about people wanting to build these gas turbines behind the meter, but we're finding that a lot of those are really not going to be very functional, whereas the quality and performance of demand side resources just keeps getting better, doesn't it?
It definitely does, and I think technology helps with that. Again, going back to the point of visibility and having more information about the demand side resources that we're relying on. I think if there is a challenge associated with scaling demand side resources, it is that there is a behavioral hurdle that you need to overcome with the customer to get them willing to enroll in a program like this. And I think when we've looked into this, what we found is the financial incentive that you're offering them matters. It needs to be sufficient, but it's not the only thing that matters. The other kind of two key things are the enrollment process needs to be really easy and streamlined. If the customer has to fax 3 forms into their utility to sign up for the program, you're probably going to lose most of them. And then the third is they need to trust the counterparty, whether that's their utility or the aggregator that they're engaging with. And so those are real barriers that need to be overcome from a behavioral standpoint. But I think a lot of what we've worked on with Uplight on the demand stack is focused on overcoming those behavioral barriers and finding ways to make this a more engaging process for customers.
And a lot of people are doing a lot of work on those 3 points right now. And this goes back to the first answer, your answer to the first question. You're showing that you can use, statistically, you're showing that you can use a lighter touch that doesn't affect customers because we have the technology to do that. But that's really the subject of another podcast, Ryan. So I'm not going to ask you to even reply to that. You said it already up front. Listeners, go back to the beginning and you'll hear him say it. I want to thank you, my guest, for another scintillating conversation, another really informative conversation. No kidding. Brattle Group Principal Ryan Hledik. He's described the concept of the utility demand stack, an innovative way to maximize the benefits of utility demand side management programs. I also want to thank our sponsor, Uplight, and my producer, Melissa Brown. And as always, I want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, follow, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.